It's so hard sometimes to know what's going on inside our own kids. They seem shut off. They seem to want to isolate from us, and they don't share with us what's. If we say, well, what's wrong, honey, or what's wrong, son? What's going on? And we don't get an answer. So I'm not trying to pretend that this is an easy problem. What I'm saying is that it's a universal problem. And the question is, what can we do? Well, this is what it looks like, by the way, from the parent's perspective. Get out of my life. But first, will you drive me and Cheryl to the mall? We laugh because it's true. There's a push for autonomy and a pull for dependence at the same time. But that's the developmentally appropriate task. Adolescents are being prepared for later, they're trying to prepare for their independence of later life. If you're lucky, you go to college, you get in a dorm, you've got your dorm masters and everything's safe, and you do all of this under the supervision of highly paid, well, I shouldn't say highly paid, but paid professionals in a structured environment. If you're not so lucky, you end up under a bridge in Spokane. So this issue of autonomy versus dependence, and identity especially. Children are forming their identity. What am I going to be? And so many of these kids trying on these different costumes and these different roles, these different, what we call fachas in Tex-Mex, are attempts to find their identity. We have to also be aware that unlike us, who seem to have an endless capacity to tolerate hypocrisies, lies, half-truths, manipulations, and distortions, adolescents have a much higher honed sense of justice, injustice, hypocrisy, and although I'm not saying that they're angels, I'm far from it, or they're faultless, I'm just saying that they're very sensitive to it. And they are asking themselves, what are my real possibilities in this world? So sincerely, what are my real chances? And don't, you can say, well, you can be president, you can be anything you want, but it's actually more difficult than that. And they also have to deal with another major issue which goes on throughout life, and that's intimacy. And now, so I mentioned age of information in the title, so there's something about that. But and so just briefly, I'm going to run through, or you could just read this, and you can also find it elsewhere, and it's also another talk if you're interested on the effects of the internet. When most of your kids under the bridges in Spokane or in your institutions are not on the internet, they don't have to deal with these issues, but you can see how important all of these are for developing intimacy and also identity. So I'm not going to go into great detail because of time limitations, but let me point out that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And that's one of the major appeals of the internet. So there's a huge amount of turmoil during adolescence. There's angst, the boredom, the how many of you remember your adolescence? Was it the best of times? Was it the worst of times? Was it the best of times and the worst of times? Okay, that's right. So let's not forget that. So looking at the mind and body, there's the hormonal shifts as well as the brain changes that we've talked about. Teenagers are more impulsive because the frontal lobes are not developed. Remember that frontal cortex I told you about? They're less likely to think twice. And I can show it quite clearly here. These are time-lapse photography. As you go from age 5 to age 20, you can see that the purple becomes more and more prominent. That's the frontal cortex developing. That's how we know that the child is developing these adult capacities. That's why we don't let them drive or drink or fight in wars. Until they've reached a certain age. There's another way of showing it. That central part of the brain is fully developed. The base part is not fully developed. Some people don't get all this neuroanatomy stuff. It's a little too complex. So I have another neuroanatomy slide that kind of puts it all together. This one typically people can understand. So what are the consequences of this? Well, this is the consequence. He's smoking the cigarettes because he's nervous being in front of a killer bull with a blindfold on. This guy decided he wanted to get a tan before he started 10th grade. Okay, a final point about attention. We've talked about attending to things, but there's also something else called human attention. Adolescents and children need attention. We've got this misconception in Western psychology that's going to change, by the way, that attention is optional. We talk about, oh, he's just looking for attention, she's just looking for attention. Well, kids need attention the way they need food or sleep. If they're starved for attention, they'll do anything to get it, and we see this all the time. When you're starved, you become indiscriminate. You'll eat anything, and this explains much adolescent attention-seeking behavior. So the question I have for us today is, does the child have attention deficit disorder, or does the child have a deficit of attention? And I submit to you that it's the latter, much more often than we're willing to admit. Finally, hexes. A hex is when you tell someone something and they believe you and it's not in their service. For example, in this case, a young girl was singing all the time the way young girls do, and her mother, in a bad mood one day, said, "Shut up, you have an ugly voice." And this young girl believed her mom, and she stopped singing. At home, at school, she never sang again. The mother had hexed her. This happened to me, by the way, with writing. It happened to me. I had a teacher who